it. So what we're trying to say here is, can we identify the ideologies that shape our world, and can we get outside of them with a different ideological perspective to critique them? That's the question we're trying to raise here. So, let me go forward and play you the next clip that I think will help do this. I'm going to go back to Naomi Klein again, who is, I think, one of the best journalists working in the world today, despite the fact that she's from Canada. You don't want to give those Canadians too much credit. It'll go to their head. So what I want to do now is play a segment from a recent talk that Naomi Klein did for the TED Talk series. Has anybody ever seen one of the TED Talks? Yeah, they're interesting. A wide array of people brought into this conference that's called TED, which stands, I think, for technology something and something. I don't remember what. But this is a TED Talk that Naomi Klein did recently, within the last 6 months, I think, that is called Addicted to Risk. So she's talking about the way in which the culture is willing to engage in what she believes to be risky behaviors. And the segment we're going to look at right now is her examination of this energy question, the big risk, she's saying, in the development of unconventional energy.
In environmental circles, we often hear that rather than shifting to renewables, we are continuing with business as usual. This assessment, unfortunately, is far too optimistic. The truth is that we have already exhausted so much of the easily accessible fossil fuels that we have already entered a far riskier business era, the era of extreme energy. So that means drilling for oil in the deepest water, including the icy Arctic seas, where a cleanup may simply be impossible. It means large-scale hydraulic fracking for gas and massive strip mining operations for coal, the likes of which we haven't yet seen. And most controversially, it means the tar sands. I'm always surprised by how little people outside of Canada know about the Alberta tar sands, which this year are projected to become the #1 source of imported oil to the United States. It's worth taking a moment to understand this practice because I believe it speaks to recklessness and the path we're on like little else. So this is where the tar sands live, under one of the last magnificent boreal forests. The oil is not liquid. You can't just drill a hole and pump it out. Tar sands oil is solid, mixed in with the soil. So to get at it, you first have to get rid of the trees. Then you rip off the topsoil and get at that oily sand. The process requires a huge amount of water, which is then pumped into massive toxic tailing ponds. That's very bad news for local Indigenous people living downstream who are reporting alarmingly high cancer rates. Now, looking at these images, it's difficult to grasp the scale of this operation, which can already be seen from space and could grow to an area the size of England. I find it helps actually to look at the dump trucks that move the earth, the largest ever built. That's a person down there by the wheel. My point is that this is not oil drilling. It's not even mining. It is terrestrial skinning. Vast, vivid landscapes are being gutted, left monochromatic gray. Now, I should confess that as far as I'm concerned, this would be an abomination if it emitted not one particle of carbon. But the truth is that on average, turning that gunk into crude oil produces about 3 times more greenhouse gas pollution than it does to produce conventional oil in Canada. How else to describe this but as a form of mass insanity? Just when we know we need to be learning to live on the surface of our planet, off the power of sun, wind, and waves, we are frantically digging to get at the dirtiest, highest emitting stuff imaginable. This is where our story of endless growth has taken us, to this black hole at the center of my country, a place of such planetary pain that, like the BP gusher, one can only stand to look at it for so long. As Jared Diamond and others have shown us, this is how civilizations commit suicide, by slamming their foot on the accelerator at the exact moment when they should be putting on the brakes. The problem is that our master narrative has an answer for that too. At the very last minute, we're going to get saved. Just like in every Hollywood movie, just like in the rapture. But of course, our secular religion is technology. Now, you may have noticed more and more headlines like these. The idea behind this form of geoengineering, as it's called, is that as the planet heats up, we may be able to shoot sulfates and aluminum particles into the stratosphere to reflect some of the sun's rays back to space, thereby cooling the planet. The wackiest plan, and I'm not making this up, would put what is essentially a garden hose 18.5 miles high into the sky, suspended by balloons to spew sulfur dioxide. So solving the problem of pollution with more pollution. Think of it as the ultimate junk shot. The serious scientists involved in this research all stress that these techniques are entirely untested. They don't know if they'll work, and they have no idea what kind of terrifying side effects they could unleash. Nevertheless, the mere mention of geoengineering is being greeted in some circles, particularly media circles, with a relief tinged with euphoria. An escape hatch has been reached. A new frontier has been found. Most importantly, we don't have to change our lifestyles after all. You see, for some people, their savior is a guy in a flowing robe. For other people, it's a guy with a garden hose. We badly need some new stories. We need stories that have different kinds of heroes, willing to take different kinds of risks. Risks that confront recklessness head-on, that put the precautionary principle into practice, even if that means through direct action, like hundreds of young people willing to get arrested, blocking dirty power plants, or fighting mountaintop removal coal mining. We need stories that replace that linear narrative of endless growth with circular narratives that remind us that what goes around comes around, that this is our only home. There is no escape hatch. Call it karma, call it physics, action and reaction. Call it precaution, the principle that reminds us that life is too precious to be risked for any profit. Thank you.
The point is to suggest that anybody who is trying to understand, explain the world to you is doing that from some ideological position. That Len Downey's claim that journalism can be non-ideological is essentially an incoherent claim. I don't know if he's not very bright or if he's confused or if he's trying to scam you. I don't know which it is. Right? I'm sure Len Downey's a lovely person. But when he claims that journalism can be non-ideological, I want to suggest he's making an incoherent claim. I'm not saying that I don't agree with Len Downey's politics. I don't even know what his politics are. I'm saying that that claim makes no sense. This last clip you saw, I think, is a very good explanation of that. That we have problems about energy. We're running out of energy. Where do you look to solve those problems? Naomi Klein just ran through one of the ways we're doing that within this framework of technological fundamentalism, the tar sands in Alberta. If you don't know about it, it's worth reading about it. It's a phenomenal situation. Literally clear-cutting huge forests, well, just wiping out huge forests to start mining this, sand, this dirt that's infused with oil, and then high intensity, high energy processing to extract that oil uses an enormous amount of water that it dumps back polluted into the system. It's a really phenomenal project, right, that we should be talking about, not only about whether it works or what's the energy return on it, but we should be talking about it, I would argue, within this concept of technological fundamentalism. Then at the end, she goes on to explain this concept of geoengineering, which maybe you've never heard about. Geoengineering is a response to the problem of climate change, climate disruption. Although there are still people in the general culture who don't believe the climate is changing because of human intervention, roughly about 99.9% of climate scientists accept this model now. Right? And the question is, what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do to intervene in the way that human beings are disrupting the climate that will have disastrous consequences for human and other life on the planet? Right? Well, one set of responses might be to reduce energy use, to reduce carbon emissions, to start rethinking the way we live and accept a world with more limits, even limits for those of us who live in the relatively affluent part of the world. Or the response can be geoengineering. And she wasn't being facetious. There are these ideas now about doing things to the atmosphere, intervening in the climate in ways that will fix the problem. So it's a perfect example of technological fundamentalism. We have a problem created by human technological activity. We burn fossil fuels, we put a lot of carbon into the atmosphere, it disrupts normal climate patterns. That's a problem that's rooted in an unintended consequence of technology. When people invented internal combustion engines, started drilling for oil, they didn't realize that burning all of this fossil fuel in these engines was going to shift the climate, did they? In the 19th century, when they hit a gusher, they didn't say, let's look ahead 150 years, maybe this could disrupt the climate. They didn't know. Right? But that technology created a problem. How do you solve the problem? From the point of view of those advocating geoengineering, you solve it not by reorienting the relationship of human beings to the world, you solve it with more technology. So you've screwed up the climate, you just intervene into the climate now with kind of fantastical ideas about shooting things into the upper atmosphere. Do you believe that we can control the consequences of shooting things up into the upper atmosphere? Do you feel safe letting a bunch of scientists going one step further to intervene in the climate? I don't know about you, I don't feel particularly safe about that, because from a technological fundamentalist point of view, I can see that these technologies have created problems which are then attempted to be solved with new technologies which just create new problems. It makes me a little wary. So I try to step outside of the technological fundamentalist point of view to critique. Right? But when I do that, I'm not claiming that I'm not ideological. I'm just claiming that there is a way to critique the dominant ideology, and we might want to consider that. Okay? That's what I mean when we bring up this concept of ideology. We look at the dominant ideologies that structure the society in which we live, and then we ask, what do we want from journalists? Do we want journalists to remain within the dominant ideology and report about the world with that set of assumptions? Or do we want journalists to step outside of that ideology and examine the world from multiple ideological perspectives? Right? Whichever one of those you want to argue for, neither one of them makes any sense when Len Downey is saying, we're non-ideological, we're outside. We're viewing the world from some place of neutrality. That's the fundamental claim I want to challenge. That there is no neutral ground on which to stand. There is no non-ideological examination of the world. Now, I'm going to end with one of my favorites. We've seen him before in class, Wendell Berry. Because sometimes when I talk about this stuff, I'm told I'm really depressing. Right? People tell me this a lot. You're really depressing. I was in a good mood till I came to your class. I was in a good mood till I met you. Life was good until I met you, Jensen. A lot of people tell me this. Mostly my kid tells me this, but that's another story. Okay, that's typical, that's a problem. Okay. So I always like, when we move into this kind of material, to end with some sort of sense of the alternatives. And early in the semester I read a poem, and I might have played a short clip, from Wendell Berry. Wendell Berry is a poet, an essayist, a novelist, a political activist of sorts. He comes out of what I would call the sustainable agriculture movement, the movement that is trying to find solutions to the problem of agriculture that don't involve more high-energy, high-technology solutions. So what I want to do, I apologize, the audio is not particularly good on this, but I think it's worth listening to. This is a recent talk that Wendell Berry gave, in which he starts with a story, an anecdote, and then reads one of his newer poems, and I'll emphasize a few of the lines from that poem after he's done. But he starts with a story that is meant to remind us that these problems we're talking about are not problems where we can easily identify the bad guy and condemn the bad guy and then feel good about ourselves, yes? If you're talking about ecological problems, who is the culprit? Who is the bad guy? Well, maybe it's, the energy companies. Maybe it's the chemical companies. Maybe you can point and say, these companies, I don't like the way they do business. Maybe you can point to the government and say, I don't like the way they have abandoned. There's all sorts of places you can point and say, I feel that these people have failed. But remember, we're all part of the world in which these problems exist. I already trapped you. I asked you how many of you have ever ridden in a car. If you've ridden in a car, you're part of the problem, right? How many of you have ever flown on a plane? How many, So we're all living in a world in which we're implicated in this, and that's important to remember. And the first story that Wendell Berry tells is meant to emphasize that. Again, the audio isn't great, but bear with us here.
Now I want to tell a story, and then I'm going to read a poem. The story came to me from Loyal Jones of Berea, Kentucky, who's one of the dear people on this earth. According to Loyal, if a fella in some parts of eastern Kentucky doesn't have his full complement of wits, he will be known as a widdy. One day this widdy was walking through town and he came upon this big hole, a huge, enormous hole. And he leaned over the edge and looked in it, and there's this fella down in the bottom of it, just digging away and throwing out the dirt. And the widdy hollered down to the digger at the bottom, "Hey, what's this hole for?" And the digger looked up at him and says, "This is where we're going to bury all the sons of bitches." The widdy leaned over and said, "Who's going to cover them up?" That's a necessary text for our effort. Now I'm going to read a poem. This is a poem without a title. It may need one, but it belongs to a series of poems I've been writing for a long time called Sabbaths. The big question, of course, for us humans is how do you get to the Sabbath? How do you reach a point of rest that's legitimate and deserved? It is hard to have hope. It is harder as you grow old, for hope must not depend on feeling good. And there is the dream of loneliness at absolute midnight. You also have withdrawn belief in the present reality of the future, which surely will surprise us. And hope is harder when it cannot come by prediction any more than by wishing. But stop dithering. The young ask the old to hope. What will you tell them? Tell them at least what you say to yourself. Because we have not made our lives to fit our places, the forests are ruined, the fields eroded, the streams polluted, the mountains overturned. Hope, then, to belong to your place by your own knowledge of what it is that no other place is, and by your caring for it as you care for no other place, this place that you belong to, though you do not own it, for it was from the beginning and will be to the end. Belong to your place by knowledge of the others who are your neighbors in it. The old man, sick and poor, who comes like a heron to fish in the creek, and the fish in the creek and the heron who man-like fishes for the fish in the creek, and the birds who sing in the trees in the silence of the fisherman and the heron, and the trees that keep the land they stand upon, as we too must keep it or die. This knowledge cannot be taken from you by power or by wealth. It will stop your ears to the powerful when they ask for your faith, and to the wealthy when they ask for your land and your work. Answer with knowledge of the others who are here, and of how to be here with them. By this knowledge, make the sense you need to make. By it stand in the dignity of good sense, whatever may follow. Speak to your fellow humans as your place has taught you to speak, as it has spoken to you. Speak its dialect as your old compatriots spoke it before they had heard a radio. Speak publicly what cannot be taught or learned in public. Listen privately, silently, to the voices that rise up from the pages of books and from your own heart. Be still and listen to the voices that belong to the stream banks and the trees and the open fields. There are songs and sayings that belong to this place by which it speaks for itself and no other. Found your hope, then, on the ground under your feet. Your hope of heaven, let it rest on the ground underfoot. Be lighted by the light that falls freely upon it after the darkness of the nights and the darkness of our ignorance and madness. Let it be lighted also by the light that is within you, which is the light of imagination. By it you see the likeness of people in other places to yourself in your place. It lights invariably the need for care toward other people, other creatures, in other places, as you would ask them for care toward your place and you. No place at last is better than the world. The world is no better than its places. Its places at last are no better than their people. When the people have made dark the light within them, the world darkens.
I'm going to, because I wanted you to get a sense of Wendell Berry, it's much more interesting to hear someone read their own work. But because the audio is not so clear, I'm going to read the last three stanzas to you. And this will be, remember how I told you that to increase your social attractiveness at parties, you should bring up, this is a great poem to bring up at social gathering this weekend. The poem is from a collection just published called Leavings, published in 2010 by Wendell Berry. And picking up where he left off, the last four stanzas are this. Listen privately, silently, to the voices that rise up from the pages of books and from your own heart. Be still and listen to the voices that belong to the stream banks and the trees and the open fields. There are songs and sayings that belong to this place, by which it speaks for itself and no other. Found your hope then on the ground under your feet. Your hope of heaven, let it rest on the ground underfoot. Be lighted by the light that falls freely upon it after the darkness of the nights and the darkness of our ignorance and madness. Let it be lighted also by the light that is within you, which is the light of imagination. By it you see the likeness of other people in other places to yourself in your place. It lights invariably the need for care toward other people, other creatures in other places, as you would ask them for care toward your place and you. And the final stanza, no place at last is better than the world. The world is no better than its places. Its places at last are no better than their people, while their people continue in them. When the people make dark the light within them, the world darkens. That's Wendell Berry. That's